Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of our faculty director, Professor Tariq Masood, I'd like to welcome you to today's event with the Middle East Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School. We're delighted to be hosting this conversation between James Snyder, Executive Chair of the Jerusalem Foundation and Director Emeritus of the Israel Museum, and Shirin Neshat, world-renowned Iranian visual artist. Shirin left Iran to study art in the US not long before the revolution, which changed the traditional Islamic trajectory of her upbringing and opened the door to a creative career. Her personal life and her creative experience have given her a unique opportunity to engage with the visual and performing arts, to interpret the nuances of the Middle East in ways that resonate with the contradictions and complexities of other cultures worldwide, this being at the core of our conversation with James tonight. Before I hand the program over to James and Shirin, please be aware that this event is being recorded. All attendees, including journalists, are prohibited from recording or distributing content from this program in any way without prior written authorization. Time permitting, we will take questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature built into this webinar. James?
Sam, thank you. Good afternoon to all of you. Actually, it's good evening. I'm in Jerusalem, so for me, it's nighttime already. It's a pleasure to get underway for this year, extending our ongoing series of conversations that look at the Middle East from the perspective of many cultural and sociocultural platforms. So far, during the last 2 years, we've explored a wide range of disciplines: the visual arts, the performing arts, dance, opera, architecture and design, film and television, monotheistic theology, always looking for ways to expand the syllabus at the Kennedy School beyond politics and public policy, and looking at social, sociocultural, and cultural agendas and platforms and perspectives. It's really an honor and a pleasure to host Shirin Neshat today. She is a highly esteemed, internationally recognized creative maker. Her disciplines began with photography and include photography, video, film, now also opera. She began in Iran. She came to America. Her trajectory was from east to west, and now and over these last many years, she looks back to the East from a Western perspective, and she creates her work from a deeply personal perspective. And at a time when exile as home is a phenomenon experienced increasingly by many, which adds resonance to her work. Her work, looking at Iran and Islam from the West, focuses on Iran after the revolution, in a way giving her the opportunity and the obligation to look at the aggravated contrast between femininity and masculinity, public and private life, antiquity and modernity, and to think about how to depict and bridge the gaps between each of these. And all of this is in a time of growing global migration, and now at a time, and it's sad, profound, and uncanny at a time when Iran again faces a revolution, this time the revolution of woman, life, and freedom. Shirin really has been recognized and embraced globally, not that Venice is always a trademark of that kind of recognition, but she did receive the International Award at the Venice Biennale in 1999, and she received the Silver Lion in 2009 at the Venice Film Festival. So she really is embraced, not just in our Western setting, but worldwide. Shirin left Iran for Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley in 1975, 4 years before the revolution in Iran. She received her BA, her MA, and her MFA there. She went on to New York in 1983, and she did not return to Iran until 1990 after Ayatollah Khomeini's death. I'd like to begin this evening at the beginning and to ask Shirin to talk about her early years in Iran, which really are the foundational stones for her own personal trajectory, and to talk about her Iran.
Thank you, James, and thank you, the Kennedy School and all the audience who unfortunately I cannot see. I grew up in a small, conservative, extremely religious town called Qazvin. And I remember that while I had an extremely happy, normal family life, I was always very conflicted between the kind of modern and progressive life that my parents lived and the kind of religious and conservative atmosphere in the city of Qazvin. And so I've always feeling very conflicted between how my family lived and their ideas and their lifestyle versus a community that was extremely opposite. And so I always felt a lot of shame and guilt, almost apologetic for the lifestyle of my family. So all I remember that was inside of my home, beyond those walls, it was a different world, where they were not wearing the hijab and they were very modern, cosmopolitan life. But outside, it was a completely different reality at school. And so this is really, I think, has registered in my mindset in terms of this conflict, this social political conflict that was a religious conflict that happened at the time that eventually led to the revolution, and how some of my own best friends became revolutionaries. And I think my father sent us away, most likely because he predicted that there was something brewing underground. But I definitely felt this tension between inside and outside of my home, the political, religious versus the more modern life in Iran.
You're anticipating my next question in a way. When you left as an Iranian, as a student who was traveling to the US to study in the US. Revolution, of course, the revolution changed that aspect of your going in a very dramatic way. And you went from being an Iranian student in the US to facing and embracing the notion of exile as home. And, in the years since then, this is an increasingly prevalent phenomenon for a lot of people, the notion that exile is where you live. And my question was going to be, did you feel that when you left, or did it overtake you when the revolution happened, or did it follow in the years thereafter?
It's exactly right. My father sent me and my siblings for studies because it became almost like a trend to send children abroad to study. But we could have never predicted that we would have had a revolution, and we had a rather normal relationship to Europe and America. But soon after I left and I arrived in the US, and I was actually quite alone because everybody else went home, we had the revolution. And of course, in 1979, and then the hostages were taken soon after. So all the diplomatic relationship between Iran and US was interrupted. And then to make it worse, the hostages were taken, and that was a huge animosity between the two countries. The war with Iraq happened at the same time. So literally, I found myself disjointed and separated from Iran, like a wall came down between me and Iran. And this was really traumatic for someone like me. I was only 17, 18, not having a family and economic help, but mainly I felt dismantled by this course of events, politically, emotionally, psychologically, and not yet feeling at home in America. So and then from there on, I think that many more Iranians have suffered greater pain that I have. Came years and years and years of separation from country and family. For me, it was 11 years before I even got to see them again.
Again, you're anticipating my next question in a way. Did you feel embraced in that first period when you were still at Berkeley, when all of this political trauma was taking place in Iran, and you were separated so far away?
No, I felt very disconnected. I was quite isolated. I didn't even really speak very good English. I had not even remote family in the US or friends, many. So at the school, I didn't do very well. I was one of the poorest students, just to be very honest. Yeah, I felt very depressed, and I really hit the bottom, I think, at that time. I'm talking about, late 70s, but really in the 80s, where I felt ill physically. It was even difficult to make a phone call to Iran or send mail. There was no post. So it was, for me as a young person, I would definitely say was the most traumatic experience in my life that hopefully I will never experience again. It took years to be able to recover and have a more or less normal life in America, and begin to embrace it.
You know, you've told me that you weren't a great art student. You did get your MFA, but you weren't a great student. And because of everything that you've just described, you really didn't focus immediately after your education on art, on your creative making. When you came to New York, you spent 10 years, you were with Kyung Park, who was your first husband, and who was the founder of the Storefront for Art and Architecture. Actually, our paths first crossed there. That's where you and I met, and you worked there. And the Storefront was a kind of laboratory for creative making. It wasn't about art per se, but it was about looking at the broadest possible range of mediums and makers. So you were engaged with artists, architects, philosophers, creative thinkers of all kinds, and their work was about creative making, which then we called art, and activism. So it wasn't looking at politics. It wasn't looking at the swarm of the political drama that was happening around you. And it wasn't about art and politics. It was rather about art and social impact. This time in your life actually intersected with when you returned to Iran for the first time after leaving for schooling. And you personally experienced the impact of political upheaval on the culture of your personal life. You and I have talked about how your Iran was an extension of the long timeline of the Persian narrative, of the imperial history of Persia. And Iran, when you went back, was the post-revolution Iran. It was a completely different story. And when you've told me this in the past, for me, it's about other examples in history where revolution, war, makes this kind of disruption and creates an opportunity for creative making. If you look at Europe between World War I and World War II, for example, that's the period when Dada and Surrealism emerged. That's a period when artists were redefined and far more broadly defined, not as artists, but as creative practitioners. And in a way, art became activism. And my question for you is, was this the impetus for your shift after 10 years to do your own creative work? How did this ignite your spirit for creative practice?
Well, let me begin with UC Berkeley. I think when I arrived, I had this very romantic idea about what art is, or what is the role of an artist. And I was really bad at it. And the idea that art is an elaboration of art history, and basically education is a way for you to discover your vision and signature and basically elaborate on it over and over again, which I wasn't very good at it. So I was very lucky that I quit being an artist for a good 10 years. And I moved to New York, and as you said, I met Kyung Park, who is the founder and director of the Storefront for Art and Architecture, a not-for-profit small grassroots organization. But I've always said that my true education in art developed in New York, the underground scene, and my collaboration with Kyung, which was essentially his interest. I would say he was an activist himself, is this relationship between art, design, architecture, and social responsibility. He never saw any of these separate from one another. And so we organized a series of programs, including exhibitions, publications, conferences, panel discussions. So I was immersed in this underground culture, like you said, philosophers to architects to artists to writers, etc. And this opened my eye to the value and possibilities with art, where it's not something that is created in a studio, where it's purely intuitive, or that an artist is born talented and you just have to dig in your brain. I learned that art is about experience, it's about a process, it's about life, it's about research, it's about intelligence, intellectual capacities. And so, but at the moment, I didn't have any subjects that I was interested in. So now, through the work of Storefront, I had developed a good education and methodology, but what I was lacking was a subject matter that I could cling on. So the return to Iran in the 1990 and the facing of this transformed society from what I remembered as Iran during the Shah period to this strictly Islamic Republic of Iran became a turning point for me, where I finally found my subject, and something that was not just a subject for art, but an obsession of a deep need for understanding of material that had impacted my own life as well. So I started to go back to Iran, and from there on, this all led to a body of artwork, and I became an artist after 10 years of not creating anything.
And, you know, soon I want to get to looking at examples of your art across the period of time from the early 90s to the present. But first, I want to stay with this point of how being at Storefront was an opportunity to engage as an activist and to understand the benefit of activism for creative makers in doing their work and having a purpose for their work. If you had not gone back to Iran, would you have shifted yourself to creative making, or do you think your path might have been otherwise?
It's very interesting you asked that, because very often at the Storefront, not only that the programs were always very socially, politically inclined, we even had programs where we went at nights where we stenciled all over the city messages about homelessness. You know, we were doing all kinds of things that were not in the line of a gallery work. We would do projects about Sarajevo, where we would bring activists to talk about the war in Sarajevo, along with the photographic exhibitions. We would do actions that were not, again, were not typical for any not-for-profit organization. So, so for me, there was this very fine balance, and even the way we worked was very collaborative. We had no money; everybody was donating their time, and just the act of holding on to this really a small grassroots organization, which drew crowds of people, was an act of activism, because we were not doing it for the money, and literally we believed in the sense of community coming together, making an impact, making a dialogue. And it reminds me very much of what young people are doing everywhere, including in Iran, except, you know, we were not fighting the government, but we were fighting corporations and the whole idea that many people, including the homeless people and people who were poor, or the housing issues, were major issues that were neglected. So yes, you're very right that there was this part of my experience at Storefront that really helped me get trained in terms of thinking about how art and activism could have this direct relationship.
And I think what happened is that by going back to Iran, suddenly there was subject matter. But interestingly, it's hard to ask this question because it's completely conjectural. But if you had stayed in Iran, might you have seized Iran as a subject for art making? Or perhaps that wouldn't have happened.
Yes, it's another great observation. What we're talking about is the need for dialogue. And what the Storefront taught me was how do you create a dialogue, and how do you go about making dialogue that are cross-disciplinary, that are not denying the importance of aesthetic and art and design, yet you don't turn away from the social, political, culture and realities. And so I think having gain that perspective, which is coming from an outside view to Iran, and yet I want to remind you that in Iran, they had gone through this incredible hard period of war, revolution, bombing, constantly, oppression that they lived in, economic sanctions, all kinds of sanctions inside and outside. So they were up against the wall. And I have to say, it was the most shocking experience for me, even to see my family. And I was coming from the outside, from an underground art institution in New York. And suddenly I felt truly interested in this investigation. But being an outsider, being someone who was living outside, I obviously had a very different perspective in all these areas that I finally framed than someone who lived in Iran. I had this distance that they didn't.
And this very much gets to the point of the evolution of your work from that moment on. And for me, and again, you and I have discussed this in the past, it's the notion that your Iran before you left was part of the long timeline of Persian history. And the post-revolutionary Iran was a new story, and in a way, a different story. And it enabled you to start looking at your culture in the context of other cultures or from different perspectives. I mean, it's very different, but I was a modern art historian. While I was at the Museum of Modern Art, all I knew about was 1850 to the present. I never lifted the rug to look at what happened before 1850 that created the platform for the trajectory of then and now contemporary art. I came to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and the story was about universalism, the way that all things connect across time and around the globe. And you, by being an Iranian immigrant, looking at Iran from the West, it really gave you the opportunity to stretch that timeline, which had been yours before you left Iran, and to look from a different perspective at Iran after the revolution. And I'm saying that comment, please, and then I want to get to some of your work beginning in the
I think it's important also to add to that, James, that while my interest was Iran, my tools were very Western as an artist, and my education, my understanding and influences from conceptual art to all kinds of things. So I always insist that my work has to be seen within that context, that I'm not an Iranian that was studying in Iran. I was educated since I was 17 years old in the US, including all my art studies, and but yet my narratives and my concepts are founded in Iran. So what you find is these images and these stories that are hybrid between Iran and the West, and even my interpretation of some of the issues in relation to Iran are highly conceptual, which may be difficult for some Iranians who may not be as familiar with, let's say, conceptual art, to really understand some aspects of it.
You've actually added a question that I'm not going to ask now. I'm going to ask it later, which is your sense of how all of us in the West look at your work and how people in Iran look at your work. But let's put that on hold, because I want to begin with your work in photography, your first medium, beginning in the early 1990s, and beginning with the work that really was about women relating to Islamic fundamentalism, Iranian militancy, and how you dealt with that subject, beginning with your series, Women of Allah.
Yes, actually, it's an excellent idea. And I think, just can you see this full, is this, Woman of Allah, let's just go right to the images, James. It's a very good departure for our conversation, because to this day, it remains very controversial. And I think a lot of people, including Iranian people, have misunderstood the meaning of this word, the intention that I had at the time. And many people have accused me of, by creating Woman of Allah, which I'll explain in a minute what it really means, is about, that it endorses or supports the Iranian Revolution. And meanwhile, the government of Iran has been critical of me, thinking that it's critical of them. And in fact, I haven't been able to go back to Iran because of the same body of work. But I want to be very clear that Woman of Allah was very first body of work that I made. Actually, before that was called Unveiling, just a year before. But it really is my look or my study of the notion of fanaticism, the religious fervor that flourished in the Iranian culture, and more specifically, how the Iranian women were impacted by it. And I'm not sure if are you seeing the pages in full or not? I'm not sure if it's, anyway. So basically, I was interested in study the ideological, philosophical mindsets of any woman who is, because it happened to be that during the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution, the women were also encouraged to become militant and participate in this faith, and you saw many women armed, etc. So I framed this question, and it really goes back to the question of martyrdom, and how a martyr stands in this intersection of love, faith, self-sacrifice, and yet cruelty, violence, and this obsession with death. So the images were embedded with this kind of totally paradoxical qualities of the female body, which was very sensual, very problematic, as it creates a sense of temptation, eroticism. The weapon is obviously a symbol of violence. The veil, that is also very controversial. For some people, it's a sense of freedom. For others, it's a form of repression. And the writing, which became poetry by Iranian women. So what I meant with these images was to create this group of work that essentially depicted this narrative about a typical martyr, and really tried to go under the skin of how would a woman be willing to do such a thing, but trying to stay away from pointing fingers or creating judgments, or saying it's good or bad. It's just basically, I feel, by framing the question, it was my critical point of view. So the images again and again had the female body, the text, the weapon, and the veil. And so again, these were very, and I want to repeat it again, this was very specific to the Iranian Revolution. These images have nothing to do with after the revolution or anything to do with today, it really was sort of is narrating a pivotal moment of Iranian history, and martyrdom being central to this government's ideology. And again, not to endorse it or celebrate it, but simply show the reality of how these women are caught in between their own biology and femininity, and yet this religious rhetoric.
And you say that it's specific in that way, and it is. That's what stimulated your creating of the work, but the resonance with other cultures in that moment and references to other periods and other cultures is something that was quite strong at the time. These images are in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, which is a universal museum, which tries to take these moments of trauma or moments of beauty or moments of transcendence and put them in context. And that gives that much more power to these moments. They're documenting exactly what you described, the moment of the revolution, but they resonate elsewhere. And that's something that's always quite powerful in your work.
And also, I felt as an artist, I just wanted to raise the questions and frame my questions as opposed to providing an answer, particularly from a perspective of an artist who lived outside and was not religious. To me, it makes I'm not interested in making work that is biased or takes side. At the time, I would say that now I have a very different relationship with this regime. At the time, I didn't even know it. It was more like understanding the revolution, the basis of the revolution. But so these body of work are mainly designed to raise critical questions and for the audience to be able to draw their own interpretations.
So is it fair to say that this body of work became a kind of launch pad for how your work would develop thereafter and for your stretching to other mediums, because you went from photography to film after this?
It's very interesting, James, because you'll see in a minute that after this experience of making Woman of Allah, I became exhausted by the type of judgments and very simplistic judgments about my work, because the work was so political that the people couldn't distance themselves from their own relationship to the regime, or if they were pro or against or whatever. And even the Westerners had this very complicated, wrong reading of the work. So I gravitated toward much more evocative video work, because I think mentally I felt drained. But what's really interesting, that majority of the people still know me by Woman of Allah, because it's so direct, even though it was made from 1994 to 1998, because it's so directly political and they can put their hands on it, where the other body of work that I've created has nothing to do with the veil or the religion of Islam, or it still deals with social political issues, but it's nothing to do so directly about the revolution. It doesn't register on their mind as much as the Woman of Allah. And they still think of me as this woman who made images about the veil, but I have not touched the veil for years. Most of my work is about women who are modern, but they still recognize me as this woman who's obsessed with the hijab.
It's interesting because anticipating our talk tonight, many people with whom I discussed it would reference these works immediately. But it's the launch pad, actually, because in every one of those conversations, other works, other mediums would be part of the discussion. But this is like the foundational stone for the work in their minds.
And I guess I should have expected it, because first of all, this was very provocative images, and also I had audience who were Iranian or Muslims. Then I had audience who were Westerners, and they were all very complex. They weren't sure what the work was trying to say, and so it created a lot of reaction, and I understand that, but I think every artist needs reaction, feedback, and interpretation. But the unfortunate part about this work is that most people could not distance their own point of views about the political issues from the work of art. So their judgment was very specific to what their ideology was, and how they perceived the art was directly that.
I want to hold that. After we look at your other work across all of this time, I want to talk about perceptions of your work at that time from the West and in Iran, and from now in the West and in Iran. But let's hold that, and let's talk now about when you moved to film. And I want to take as an example Turbulent from 1999, which is also pretty iconic as your work in that medium.
I just have to, my friends who don't know me very well, to just also explain that even though I stopped making a lot of those photographs and I moved on to video and film, that women were always at the center of my work, Iranian women. And always my work was about showing how resilient, strong, powerful, defiant the Iranian women were coming into Turbulent, and coming away from Woman of Allah. This was my first video. To me, turbulent is if I could explain a little, James, it's about the element of protest. It really is, because what you had, and I'm going to show you a very short clip. Maybe I showed the short clip and then I do a little explaining, or just a move to, because what I wanted to mention also, James, that the move to video was that I could also get away from the studio, to be able to include music, background, again, to be able to collaborate, to have a little story that has a beginning, middle, and the end. And ultimately, my desire to make some things that are very lyrical and poetic, but they're not hammering you on your head with any kind of political message. And so for me, this was a major sort of move as I turned against my own signature, as my photography was suddenly becoming successful. I just completely turned my back to it. And this was moving toward double channel projections on two opposite walls where people had to see them simultaneously. And it really was the beginning of a new chapter for me.
So let's look at the film. And I have to say to those who haven't seen it before, it is arresting. It is absolutely arresting to look at this.
See if I can come to this. Okay. Thank you. Just for my friends, I want to give a little background that initially this project was designed with the concept or the issue of women in Iran who are not allowed to have public performances while the men do. And so the absence of women in the industry, in public spaces. But it really was much more than that. It was about how those, like the men in Iran who are less against the wall, tend to be far more conformist and accept the situation where the women who are against the wall tend to rebel and reinvent and find a way of protesting and creating their own space. And so here is a man who's singing a very traditional music that is by Shahram Nazeri to this great a room full of men where the woman has no audience, and ultimately she breaks all the rules of traditional music, and her music becomes an expression of various type of emotions, from anger, frustration, and so it is a form of protest, and ultimately she becomes victorious, which to me, it's also references to what's going on today in Iran, that the more you press the women of Iran against the wall, the more victorious and rebellious they become.
And this is very specific to Iran. At the same time, it resonates elsewhere. The power of it, in my view, is how it resonates with people from other cultures and other cultural heritages. And actually, this is what, you spoke about how at the beginning, Women of Allah is really so specific to Iran in its moment. And yet there was resonance. And here, that resonance is incredibly broad.
Thank you for saying that. I think I learned throughout my career, as I've worked in different body of work, I've learned the best way to communicate with the audience is that while you can be very ethnically specific, to approach it in a very universal human level, because it's far easier for the audience to understand it in that way. And for example, if I had to translate and explain a lot about Women of Allah, I didn't have to explain anything about Turbulent when it was first seen at the Venice Biennial. Everybody got it, and it was extremely subversive. It was Persian music, and yet it was very concise. And I learned that you can do that with the moving picture, which is something very difficult to get with photography, and the subtleties that you could build into an artwork, unfortunately, you can't in a photograph. And we're so inundated with images, especially with social media and elsewhere, and that. But for me, the moving picture is really it has a possibility to build a narrative and build a lot of metaphors in a deeper level.
There's also the investment of time on the part of the viewer so that the viewer gets immersed in the subject and gets immersed in the work that you're creating. It's interesting as you say this, and again, referring to Women of Allah and how specific it was to that political moment. It wasn't photojournalism, but it was documentation of a political moment in time.
That's
whereas
right.
Making a video is another story altogether.
That's a very good point. And many of my work, including Women of Allah or The Woman Without Men, the movie that I made in 2009, which took place in 1953 in Iran, they were all about a particular history in Iran. It was 1953 coup exercised by the CIA, and the Woman of Allah, 1979 revolution, the Book of Kings, 2009 Green movement. So I've had many work that were very specifically elaborating on a particular history. But here, of course, it's taking place during the Islamic regime, but it's not about capturing a moment of history.
Correct. Now, when you made Turbulent, you were, as you are, an Iranian living outside of Iran, here in the West, and again, looking very specifically in Iran. I want to jump 20 years to 2019 and look together at Land of Dreams. When you're not so much an Iranian immigrant in America, you're an Iranian American by then. And your perspective in Land of Dreams is about the US and the West through a non-Western lens. It's a little bit of reversal in a funny way. So I want you to talk about it, please.
Yes, I want to explain to my friends that after being away from Iran, when I was not able to travel anymore to Iran, I felt exhausted with this living in constant state of nostalgia and making work that makes believe is Iran, like working in Morocco, Egypt, Turkey, etc. And I felt that there was some things going on in this country, and it's a country that I've been living longer than in my own country. I'm an Iranian American, and that I had certain investment in this country, in the future of this country, and I had certain love for this country as much as criticisms. And I thought, what if I turn my lens toward America and really give my point of view about this country in the same mannerism as I did with Iran, always from the outsider, always a point of view from someone who's standing on the outside looking in, you know. And so I started this project called Land of Dreams that involved 111 photographs, a video installation, as well as a feature-length movie, which essentially the portraits, as you can see, became a portrait of America. I went to New Mexico, which I selected as one state that had the most fascinating demographics, a mix of Native Americans, African Americans, Hispanic community, extremely poor communities, and also a spectacular landscape. And essentially, I photographed people from different ethnic, racial backgrounds, languages, and religious backgrounds, different ages, different gender. And what you see is essentially some of the faces that I have photographed, again, traveling all over New Mexico to make sure that I get diverse communities, as you can see here. And so the writings and the work that was inscribed on the photographs, however, were Farsi language, but also from a book that was from Iran, that was very ancient book, believed from 13th century, that was a very loose kind of not translation, interpretation of dreams. So what you found here was these images of Westerners, Americans, yet the writings and the inscriptions, the calligraphy became my incorporating myself and my own cultural backgrounds into this work. And so this work became a hybrid of Iran and America, Shirin and America. And really the work, Land of Dreams, became my story. This was the image of the main protagonist, Iranian woman, immigrant, who was a photographer, who became obsessed with photographing Americans and collecting their dreams. And that's exactly what I did. And eventually, and this is the spectacular landscape of New Mexico. These are some of the images of the video where we actually, just to explain to my friends, that the video involved this one channel that was taking place inside of this very claustrophobic, industrial, absurd colony, Iranian colony, that was like a factory that many Iranian men and women were there basically going through Americans' portraits, but their dreams, and interpreting Iranian Americans' dreams. It was obviously satire and taking place like a very surreal situation, but it was inside of this mountain where all these men and women, Iranian, were candidly, secretly interpreting, analyzing, interpreting Americans' dreams. I have, and then on the other side, she went to the American towns and visited people's home one at a time, and basically asked to take their pictures and also collected their dreams. I have a very short excerpt of the video if James, you wanted to see. Oh, sorry. When you're ready, I can play it.
Thank you. So you're in the army.
Yeah, I was there.
For how long?
Too long, way more than I care to remember.
It's really amazing photographs.
Yes, I was there for that one.
Actually, do you mind if I just ask you one more favor?
I guess so.
Would you tell me your last dream?
A last dream. You know, it's always the same dream. Same place, same time. No, it isn't a dream. It's a nightmare. There's this whitish blue light that shoots across the sky, you see. Black smoke rises to form a cloud that covers the sun. I can now look at the sun directly with naked eyes from behind the black smoke. I hear people screaming. The sun is gonna fall. The sun is gonna fall. A strong wind sweeps across the land. The air is full of dust and flying objects. And then there's silence. Dead silence. The sun has died behind the deep black cloud as it starts to rain. Black rain. Raindrops of oil and
Just want to explain that we looked at turbulence before, and I just want to explain that this was very similar in approach of creating opposites. You know, there you had a man and a woman, a theater full of people, empty theater, traditional music, non-traditional music, stationary camera, rotating camera. Here you had interior, oppressive, claustrophobic space of a colony. And then you had this open space of New Mexico, Southwest, beautiful landscape. You had dream, you had reality, and you know, basically two opposite worlds, you know, and the only thing that was able to cross over was this individual. And to me, that individual was me. The artist and the person who's not quite at ease at any of one is extremely oppressive, authoritarian, Kafkaesque life, and the other is a life that she also cannot relate to. So it's a very political work. Obviously, it's about the antagonism between Iran and US, how forever they've been each other's enemies. And that how Iranian government could even conceive the idea of collecting American subconscious, their dreams, to spy on them. But it also shows the issues and the problems in the American society, the poverty, the fear of violence and extreme sense of displacement, all of that. So it's really a woman who's navigating between two worlds that are opposite, and each side have their own issues and problems, and how she can't find peace at any of them.
You know, what you're describing now really relates to what will be my last question, which is about the resonance between art and politics. And I do want to move on to your most recent new medium, which is opera. But I first want to say two things here. One is, you know, you started saying it's a portrait of America, and yet it's a portrait of America through a non-Western lens. You're still wearing Iranian glasses. You're not Walker Evans, documenting a traumatic moment in American life and political history, you're looking through a different lens, and yet you're looking at this country. And the story is about turbulence and about turbulent times. And there is a surrealism here, which is just like surrealism 100 years ago when it was invented in turbulent times.
I just want to add also, James, that I think part of my hesitation of ever doing any project relation to America was that I didn't feel qualified as a non-native. But now I feel that, I may not be making work about Iran or Iranian people, but I am Iranian. And every work that I would make is from the point of view of an Iranian, and it would have that flavor. And even the themes that I would choose, for example, such as dreams and the idea of surveillance and the idea of fear of authority, it's because we have lived with fear and surveillance forever, for 43 years. And I think my Iranian friends will know what I'm talking about. So no wonder that I would choose topics, even in relation to American society, it's really definitely coming from an Iranian, you see, and that won't be something that an American would use. So, and so now I feel comfortable in that sense that I don't have to forever make work about Iran or Iranian people or narrative. I am Iranian, and as long as I am behind the work will continue to remain Iranian.
Well, and you're saying that is a perfect segue to what I want you to discuss next, which is why you shifted to work in opera and you directed Aida in Salzburg in 2017, and then again this past summer. And, here you are as an Iranian picking a Western medium to look at a subject, the subject for which in the opera is deeply anchored in the Middle East.
I wanted to say that, first of all, for some very strange reason, I've always given myself the freedom to experiment. I'm not really trained as a photographer. I've never studied film. I've never studied filmmaking, like writing scripts and directing. Everything I've done has been by learning along the way, and embracing different languages and challenging myself to be a new beginner, and not being intimidated by how I might lack the education in that field. And so in that sense, I'm really an interdisciplinary artist, and I don't have a traditional practice as an artist. But the opera, I didn't seek it. I have to say that the director of Salzburg Festival felt that so much of my work is about the relationship of music and image. It's how I tell the story in my videos. And there's very rarely any language. And opera is about music and theater, and it's about choreography. I am very much interested in choreography in all of my videos. So he felt that I would be a good candidate. And not only that, is that Aida ends up being a very controversial, fascinating, beautiful piece of music, but written by Verdi, that by many has been accused of being, including Edward Said, by being too much of an Orientalist opera, being that it took place in ancient Egypt and Ethiopia, and being that the main protagonist was an Ethiopian princess. And so this triangle of, politics and the war, and yet the religious fervor being the church, and then this love triangle between Aida, Amneris, and Radames, and this love triangle was perfect for me, because my work has so much been about this intersection of politic, religion, and the individual. And so I gave myself the challenge first in 2017. And then I was given another chance to completely reinterpret my own production and give it another try. And we really added a lot more videos, and we completely changed the dramaturgy, and it was really fascinating for me to work live. But I must say that I also, the second round, I was able to incorporate many of my own country's issues, such as some of the most feminist issues in it. And so I was able to be much more bold and less afraid by lacking the experience. I think the first time, working with Riccardo Muti, the conductor, and Anna Netrovko, the amazing soprano singer. So this time I came back with giving myself more confidence in terms of the ideas behind the story and the execution.
And I can say, knowing both productions, that the political turbulence of the last 4 years also made a shift in how you envisioned and realized the production between 17 and 22.
Absolutely. The world was a different place. We had the pandemic, we had the war between Russia and Ukraine, things were going wild in Iran. We had, the world was totally a different place. Even music festivals were handicapped by so many of the Russian musicians not being allowed to perform. We all felt the pressure in a way that we didn't feel before. And a lot of our issues became universal and global, if I could say. And some of the symbolism far more easier for people to understand now than before, because they felt it. They felt the brutality of war. I mean, may I be very honest? Aida has been essentially a really horrible glorification of war. We've had scenes over and over again in traditional Aida, people, Egyptians going to Ethiopia, massacring, genocide in Ethiopia, coming back with slaves and patting themselves on the back. We refuse to depict war in that way. We focus on the slaves. We focus on the people who were the target. We try to show the brutality of war. We try to show the pressure on this woman, the two main women, both as victims of these scenarios, and where in the past they're shown as idiots, that they basically have no real identity as women, and we showed them as individuals, and that they took decisions. So I was blamed, of course, by many traditional writers or viewers of changing too much of original Aida. But I refused to do what I did previously, which is to be modest and cautious.
Well, and you were triggered by the turbulence that has really been aggravated between 2017 and today. And this takes me to what I think will be the last question that I want to ask you, and then I think we'll have time for a few questions from those who are with us now. But my last question relates to the moment that we're in, the moment in time we're in. There is a revolution ongoing now in Iran, and in countries all over the world, there's this dramatic shift from left to right. There's also a shift in some places from right to left. And how is all of this affecting your thinking now about the work that you will do next and the mediums that you think you will work in next? And what you've just described about the shift in your attitude about Aida from 5 years ago to today relates to this.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that I believe that everything that I've made so far from beginning until now has been very consistently about women confronting power, women who refuse to remain oppressed, and women who are defiant, and also this issue of people fighting against religious and political oppression, for me, this has been an ongoing conversation in every work, from Woman of Allah to Turbulent to the Land of Dreams, really questioning authoritarian governments who control their citizens through surveillance. It's always about the desire for emancipation, to be always fighting and protesting against power, to be free, and not to live in fear. So many of the characters that I've portrayed in my work have been inundated by fear and anxiety, yet they've always fought back. Never I have ever depicted a woman as a loser. So I'm so glad that my narratives have proven to be right in their depiction of Iranian women. But James, this is also a little bit about me and my own nature. As you can see, I have been in this country alone since 17 years old. I've learned to stand in my 2 feet, and who I am is because of myself. I've gone through a lot of ups and downs. I've fallen down plenty of times, but I've always stood up. And I have been able to manage a lot of criticism. I've been, banned from going to Iran. The government of Iran has blacklisted me. The people of Iran sometimes have criticized me as something. There are people who have supported me. I've been criticized by Western critics, by all kinds of people who normally should be destroying you. But my nature as a person who's very resilient, it borrows from the country I come from, the woman who I've inspired by generation after generation. I am an example of the kind of women that are coming from my country, and so we always fight back and we go our way. And so about the future, I'm so right now in the midst of the narrative that is unraveling in Iran, that I'm not able to think immediately about what is next for me. My concentration is to give my absolute support and love to the people of Iran, to the women of Iran, to the young people who are risking their lives. And that's all I'm really focusing on. I'm preparing some new work that happens to be about sexual assault that is happens on women who are incarcerated in prison. This is something I shot in spring, not today, but happened to be also relevant. But I continue to do my work from the outside. And I'm never going to be the speaker of the women of Iran or the people of Iran, but I will continue to make art. And I continue to be inspired by the people, especially the women of Iran.
Well, and you've remained firm in your convictions from the very beginning, from the moment of your being back in Iran in 1990, from Women of Allah to the present. You change mediums. No one would say that you're a dissident artist. That's not what it is. But what your work is about is exactly this resonance between the political turbulence of the times we live in over time and creative making that can produce work of beauty. And that's actually what your work is all about.
Thank you.
And we thank you. Now, Sam, I think we have time for 2 questions and then we'll conclude.
Sounds good. First question from Shakir Mustafa. Santiago Zabala says only art can save us. I agree, and I believe Shirin's art must have saved lives. If you agree, can you say something about how deeply art is involved in saving humanity?
Wow, I got chills hearing that. I've always thought about how, as artists, we play such an important role because artists are not biased. We don't have an agenda, and we're able to tap into people's emotions in the way that no one can. No diplomat can, and that artists come from the core of the society, and they talk about the people to the people, and that I think that this is Iranian society is the greatest example that with the least amount of support, without any freedom of expression, with all the censorship, who is most important is our cultural figures, from musicians to theater directors, filmmakers, visual artists, to poets, because they have an ability to inspire, to provoke, and mobilize the people in a way that no one else can. And I think a lot of it is emotions. I feel that my work is all about emotions. It's not about propaganda. It's not about sending messages. It's not about being biased. It's about our humanity. And I do believe that art can be a transformative experience. I really do. And I take my role very seriously. I've personally have had times where I've seen movies or pieces of music that I've felt that have changed my life, definitely have changed my life. And I'm not the same person after that. And I really think that's the greatest aspiration for every artist, to make important work and to make an impact.
This question is from Elise Bernhardt. I'm curious to hear how your ideas for working in the theater have changed since you did your first theatrical production at the Kitchen in 2001. That work was an incredible political statement, doing it so soon after 9/11.
Well, I think there's something very powerful about theater, which it's quite frightening at the same time, which is the live component, is that everything and anything can go wrong, and you don't quite have the control of it. Where in film, you edit for several months or whatever, and you put it in public, and the rest is, and so I think this element of the fact that everything is the moment. There's something very powerful that a singer who's singing has to be totally present right there and then, and that lighting that is coming on, or the person who's moving the stage, or the people that are walking on this, everything has to work. But also another thing is the chemistry between the audience and the singers on the stage has to be just right, just the right balance. And if it's not the same thing. So there's a magic, I believe, in theater that I don't think it's possible to recreate in something that is carefully edited in the background and just put in front of it. Having said that, as my last note, I wanted to say that sometimes I feel like a single photograph could be so powerful and so magical in the way that a single gaze, expression, a movement on the face, it could be just perfect. And it could have very powerful impact. So I think I don't want to overemphasize it, because I think every medium, every language has its own power, but they are different. But there's something very powerful about theater.
Shirin, all of these last comments have been really fantastic. And I think Shirin actually has an exhibition opening in New York in January. And I think we'll all look forward to seeing what you will be producing next. And what I want to say in conclusion is only that you have captured in your words very well the notion that, of course, art exists, politics exists. Art transcends politics. It enlightens us, it enlivens us, and it offers light in times of darkness. And we're in dark times at the moment. And perhaps the political world should pay a little more attention to and learn some lessons from what we do in the worlds of art and culture. So you've inspired me to think that, and I want to thank you, and I want to thank you for being with us this afternoon and evening here. And I want to thank everyone who's been with us. It's been a pleasure to do this together.
And thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone who's listened to this program. Thank you, James.